Welcome. It's so nice to see so many familiar names and so many new ones out there in webinar land. The response to today's lecture has been phenomenal, and it thrills me to see the truly global reach of today's audience. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies and Penn's Global Medieval and Renaissance Studies Faculty Working Group, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture, which, as you know, will be presented by Professor Claudia Rapp from the University of Vienna, who will be introduced momentarily by my colleague Julia Verkolantsev, Professor of Russian and East European Studies at Penn, and the founder and director of the university's program in Global Medieval and Renaissance Studies. For those of you who don't know me, and I think that's a lot of you, or the Schoenberg Institute, I should introduce myself and would also like to say a few words about the Institute, as many may be unfamiliar with our work. My name is Lynn Ransom, and I'm the curator of the Institute's programs. The mission of the Schoenberg Institute, or SIMS as we often call it, is to bring manuscript culture, modern technology, and people together to bring access to and understanding of our shared intellectual heritage. To that end, we aim to make our resources, programs, and data available to scholars and students around the world. We invite users at all levels, for example, to use and contribute to projects such as the Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts, or to freely use manuscript data available in OPEN, our fully open access repository of metadata and images. You can find out more about these and other projects that we are working on by visiting our website at www.schoenberginstitute.org. In addition to making data available to the world, we also seek to bring scholars from around the world to Penn to study our manuscripts through a visiting research fellowship program. While our fellowship program is on pause this year due to the pandemic, we will be starting it back up in 2022 with a new call for applications. And this fall, as we have done every year since 2008, we will host the annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. This year, our topic will be Translating Science, which is currently being planned as an in-person event for October 14th to 16th, though this may change and there may be some virtual component as well, or it may be totally virtual, who knows at this point. In addition to these programs, we also publish a biannual journal called Manuscript Studies. If you're interested in submitting, please feel free to contact us at any time. We are actively seeking submissions for the next volume, volume 7, and the 2 issues in 2022. We're also delighted to be able to host and co-host events such as today's lecture, and to be able to do this virtually and bring so many people together than we would have thought possible in pre-COVID-19 times. If anything good has come out of the last year, that is that the virtual lecture and conference format has enabled a much broader and richer opportunity to share knowledge with colleagues around the world. We at SIMS have already begun planning more events such as this one and for the year to come, and we will be sharing those details soon through our social media platforms. Before handing the screen over to Professor Verkolantsev, I do have a few housekeeping items to share. First, Professor Rapp has kindly agreed to let us record the presentation. We will be posting the video to the Schoenberg Institute's YouTube channel and announcing it on Twitter and Facebook. Please do follow us and share widely once it is up. It should be available at the end of next week, if not before. Secondly, in order to include as many registrants as possible, we have made this a webinar, which means the interaction is somewhat limited for participants. However, you may post questions at any time in the Q&A, and you should be able to see and to upvote questions that you're most interested in hearing the answer to, as well as post comments to them. Questions and comments will be moderated before being posted to avoid offensive or disruptive posts. My colleague Dot Porter, the SIMS Curator of Digital Research Services, and I will be moderating the Q&A. And at the end of the lecture, Professor Verkolantsev will identify questions from the moderated list to ask them to Professor Rapp. So without further ado, I will hand the screen over to Professor Verkolantsev to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. This event is co-organized by the faculty group in Global Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and we are excited to host Professor Rapp in our virtual Penn space. Professor Rapp took up her current position as Professor of Byzantine Studies at the University of Vienna in 2011, after 17 years at the University of California, Los Angeles, where for 10 years she spearheaded the multi-campus research group in late antiquity, and where I had the good fortune to take a couple of her classes, including her legendary Greek paleography class. She got her BA from the Free University Berlin and her PhD from Oxford University. In Vienna, she is the director of the Division of Byzantine Research within the Institute for Medieval Research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Professor Rapp's research focuses on social and cultural history, often from the angle of religious history and manuscript studies. Her book, Holy Bishops in Late Antiquity, Christian Leadership in an Age of Transition, which traces the evolution of the role of the bishop as the highest church official in the city, from model Christian to model citizen, was published in 2005 and reissued in paperback in 2013, and is also available in an ebook format. Her most recent book, Brother Making in Late Antiquity and Byzantium, Monks, Laymen, and Christian Ritual from 2016, is the first comprehensive study of Adelpha Poesis and presents a detailed analysis of the 66 manuscripts that contain the ritual and a translation of 16 prayers. This book has led to the formation of the Vienna Ecologia project at the Austrian Academy of Sciences that studies prayer books for the use of priests as sources for daily life and social history. With the help of the Wittgenstein Award, Professor Rapp has assembled a team of scholars for the joint project, Mobility, Microstructures, and Personal Agency in Byzantium, a multidisciplinary exploration of geographical, cultural, and social mobility, which aims to re-evaluate the Byzantine society and culture that has traditionally been depicted as stiff, rigid, and encumbered by its own tradition. As the scholarly director of the Sinai Palimpsest project, she has worked closely with a large international group of experts to make this rich cultural heritage accessible. Please join me in welcoming Professor Claudia Rapp to our virtual podium.
Thank you very much, Professor Vakulanchev, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and I'm grateful to the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies and the Global Medieval and Renaissance Studies Faculty Working Group for inviting me to contribute to their academic activities this year from afar. I hope that there will be other occasions in the future when we can meet in person. I've been told that many friends and colleagues across the globe are also listening in, and I would like to acknowledge you all in this very summary fashion. It is one of the benefits of our current situation that this way of sharing scholarship is increasingly common as a complement to, but never a replacement of, personal interaction. I should preface my remarks by saying that in about 20 minutes, you will hear sounds from the background that announce that my building will be closed, but that can be ignored. And I should also let you know that there is at the end of my PowerPoint a slide with suggestions for further reading. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. And go to presentation mode. There we are. The southern Sinai is considered by many as a sacred landscape where God has revealed himself. The towering mountaintop of Jebel Musa is where, according to tradition, Moses received the 10 Commandments. In the valley below blooms the burning bush from which Moses heard the voice of God. In both locations, a mosque now stands next to a church, indicating that these places are special to Christians and Muslims alike. Once Christianity had gained a foothold in the early Byzantine Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, monastic settlements in the form of scattered hermitages sprang out throughout Egypt, including the Sinai, and the area became a destination for pilgrims who wanted to walk in the footsteps of the scriptures and to catch a glimpse of the monastic experience. In the late 380s, Egeria, an ascetically minded noblewoman, probably from Spain, traveled to Egypt and the Holy Land and left a Latin description of her visit for the benefit of her spiritual sisters in the West. Egeria and many pilgrims like her followed the established Roman trade routes to the Mediterranean, to the Red Sea, to the Arabian Gulf, and the land route north towards the desert oasis of Palmyra. These were also trading posts, and in order to protect them, Roman military installations were built along the major roads in the 5th and 6th centuries. At that time, in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian also included the southern Sinai in his vision of a global empire whose influence extended from the southern coast of Spain to the Caucasus and from the Balkans to Ethiopia. So here you see the monastic settlements in the Sinai Peninsula in the south, just to reinforce the idea that the monastery, which we now consider unique, was actually part of a larger settlement of monastic dwellings. Thanks to the Emperor Justinian's initiative, between 548 and 565, a large three-aisled basilica was erected, and you see it behind me, that carries the monograms of the emperor and the late Empress Theodora, as well as the inscription of the builder Stephen of Isla. The entire site was surrounded by fortified ramparts that have withstood the vagaries of time and were last reinforced under Napoleon in 1798. Of course, there's continued building work going on nowadays as well. At the time of the Justinianic foundation, the monastery was still dedicated to the theme of transformative encounters with the divine, Moses and the burning bush, and the transfiguration of Christ, which can now be seen again in its original 6th century splendor, thanks to recent restoration work by an Italian team. The association with St. Catherine can be traced only to the 12th century and perhaps a little earlier, after her relics were found on one of the other summits of the mountain range that skirts the monastery to the east. Catherine is a fitting patroness for a monastery with an important library. She was a convert from a noble family in 3rd century Alexandria and died as a martyr for her faith after holding her ground in a learned disputation with pagan philosophers. Throughout the centuries, under the Byzantine Empire and after the Arab conquests of the 7th century under Abbasid, Fatimid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman rulers, and currently under the political authority of the Arab Republic of Egypt, and in close relation to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, St. Catherine's Monastery has been a point of convergence for different peoples, cultures, and languages. And that's going to be the focus of my presentation this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are listening. To anyone who visits St. Catherine's today, as much as to the eager travelers of yore, the monastery appears as a treasure trove of buildings, icons, and books. And indeed, since 2002, the entire area, not just the monastery itself, but the area around it, is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Over 2,000 icons, there's no detailed record as of this moment, include the earliest surviving masterpieces of that art created in encaustic, that is hot wax technique. As a collection, the icons offer to the scholar a representative cross-section of Byzantine icon painting through the ages. And this is now accessible on a website at Princeton University, the work that done several decades ago by Kurt Weitzman. But of interest to us here is the library, which is remarkable in the richness of its holdings that extends across the centuries and represents the most important languages of medieval Christendom. The library contains well over 4,500 manuscripts, plus a significant number of early printed books. The original collection was even larger because a substantial number of manuscripts or parts of manuscripts of Sinai provenance are now dispersed in libraries from St. Petersburg to Los Angeles. Indeed, it was in that context of the seminar that Professor Verkolanchev referred to that she herself identified one of the UCLA manuscripts as being of Sinai provenance. St. Catherine thus joins a small handful of monasteries. Other examples in the Latin West are St. Peter in Salzburg or St. Gall in Switzerland that can look back on an unbroken tradition of augmenting and preserving its manuscript collection through the centuries. And in all of this, the remoteness of the Sinai did not act as a barrier, but as a magnet that brought people from all over Christendom to the monastery, often in conjunction with pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And this cultural richness is reflected in the library holdings. So what I'd like to do in the following, similar to an archaeologist who digs ever deeper into earlier layers of history, I present this evidence in 3 time slices. I begin with what we call the old collection, that is the largest, then move to the so-called new finds, and then in the final and most extensive part of my paper, I talk about the palimpsests. So starting with the old collection. For the most part of the long history of the monastery, books were kept in a room adjacent to the church and in other locations, including the monks' cells. At a certain moment, perhaps after an earthquake in 1201, manuscripts were gathered in a room in the Tower of St. George, located along the north wall of the enclosure. In 1734, Archbishop Nikephoros Marthalis, and I should mention that the abbot of the monastery is traditionally also holds the title of Archbishop. Archbishop Nikephoros Marthalis decided to create a designated library along with an inventory and cataloging system. But as travel records of learned people and manuscript hunters of the 19th century indicate, books continued to be kept in other locations as well. Since 2017, the library is located in a new location in the South Wing that was renovated with funding from the St. Catherine Foundation, as you can see here, also from the photograph by the monastery's librarian, Father Justin, who also maintains a blog that is highly recommended. Since its foundation, the monastery has been associated with Constantinopolitan Orthodoxy, with the monks worshipping in the Greek language. But we also know that the liturgy was celebrated at various moments in history in Latin and Georgian, and certainly through many, many centuries in Arabic. So looking at the language distribution in the old collection, I give you the statistics here. The largest language group, and here's the pie chart, which is easier to understand. The largest language group are manuscripts in Greek with 69%, and it has been estimated that at least 70% of them contain liturgical texts. Following by a large margin, the next largest language representation are manuscripts in Arabic, 18%, showing that over its long history, the monastery catered to the liturgical needs of people who were steeped in what was the local language starting with the 7th century. Next in importance is Syriac, the language of Melkite Christians from Egypt to the Euphrates, and manuscripts in Georgian constitute only 2.5% of the total. That would be this segment here. How did these manuscripts reach the monastery? Many of them were brought by monks and other pilgrims, and either given as gifts during their lifetime or left as a donation after their death. There's often been talk about a scriptorium in the Sinai, but concrete evidence for this is very slim. The best place for this to look is the scribal notes, where copyists record the circumstances of their work. But the frequency with which copyists do this varies significantly between language groups. And I give you here the most significant ones, the Greek, the Syriac, and the Georgian. Of the 2,319 Greek manuscripts in the old collection, 189 carry information about their date and place of production. And only 34 of those were produced either at the Sinai or at the monastery's dependencies in Rhythu and Crete. That is 18% of the Greek colophons, or 1.5% of the entire Greek collection that was demonstrably copied at the Sinai or at monasteries related to the Sinai. So there is no evidence, I would submit, for a Greek scriptorium apart from inspired guesswork. It is striking, however, that the Greek scribes are relatively reluctant to leave colophons compared to their Syriac and Georgian counterparts. The Georgians left frequent lengthy subscriptions that attest indeed to the existence of a Georgian scriptorium at the Sinai. There are 86 Georgian manuscripts in the old collection, 15 of which carry a date and location of their production. And of these, 13 were copied at the monastery within a 100-year time span from about 974 to 1074. And it is during this heyday of their scribal activity that the Georgians also had a very strong monastic presence in the Holy Land. The 11th century saw not only extensive copying activity in Georgian, it was also the time when Slavic manuscripts in Glagolitic script were produced in the Sinai. The next great phase in manuscript production at the monastery was the 13th to 15th century, when Melkite Syrians were most active. There are 266 manuscripts in Syriac in the old collection. 75 of those indicate their provenance, and about half of them were copied in the monastery and produced within this time frame. Interestingly, there was multilingualism already built into what was going on with manuscript production on that limited scale that I just outlined already in the 13th century, especially associated with Archbishop Arsenios. There's evidence that under his archbishopric and him holding also the task of the rank of abbot, there was copying done at the monastery in Greek, in Arabic, and in Syriac. So this may serve as precious evidence for the need of liturgical and theological texts for a multilingual monastic community where speakers of all three languages were valued. Now moving on to the new finds. The new finds contain discarded and neglected manuscript materials that only became known in 1975. This depository was probably started in 1734 when Archbishop Marthalis moved the book collection to a newly designated library space, as has been mentioned before. Those manuscripts that were no longer in use were left behind and apparently forgotten in the Tower of St. George, and it stands to reason that over time more manuscripts were added to this room. They were rediscovered in 1975 when 4 years after a fire in St. George's Chapel, the debris was cleaned up, and one of the major initiators of this was His Eminence Archbishop Damianos, who is still in office today. With the new finds, we can penetrate into an earlier stage in the history of the manuscript collection, prior to the construction of the library in 1734, although by how long exactly is impossible to say, because in most cases we do not know when a manuscript reached the monastery or how long it was in use. As a result of the discovery of the new finds, the library holdings were increased by more than 30%, especially in the languages of Oriental Christianity. There were some 1,200 manuscripts parts of manuscripts and fragments, including 423 manuscript items. We now call them items rather than manuscripts to avoid the impression that they're intact codices, because very often in the new finds they're not. So 423 manuscript items in Greek, often of early date, and thus preserving precious evidence for different styles of majuscule writing. A very large number of items in Georgian, closely followed in number by those in Syriac, with Arabic following at some distance, and a significant number of items in Latin. Here you see the distribution. It's interesting that here Arabic discards are very rare, suggesting that texts and manuscripts in that language continued to be used and valued rather than being discarded. Compared to the old collection, there is a significantly higher amount of writing in Georgian, and that still needs to be explained. Maybe it means that manuscripts carrying text in Georgian became so disheveled by frequent use over time that they were given an honorable discharge. There's also a strikingly high percentage compared to the old collection of manuscript objects in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, which we abbreviate CPA. That is a variation of Aramaic used by the Orthodox Christians in Palestine since the 6th century. Their presence in this depository can be explained by the fact that this language ceased to be used in the liturgy in the 13th century. So the new finds offer a different view from a different time slice of the languages represented in the monastery through its manuscripts. It is safe to assume that the people who brought these books or made use of them in the preceding centuries were conversant in all these languages. Now moving on to the earliest layer, namely the palimpsests. In keeping with their utilitarian character, the new finds manuscripts contain a very high percentage of palimpsested materials. Palimpsestation removes existing text from parchment folia. You can see this in the illustration from the Latin West of the 14th century, where you can see people working at removing text from parchment folia, either by scraping or by washing. This form of pre-modern recycling results in an extant and well-preserved overtext and an erased undertext that may or may not be legible or even discernible to the naked eye. For example, in this slide, you can see that there is a bit of red ink showing through, or here you can see an initial indicating that there's erased undertext underneath. Palimpsestation is thus another practice of honorable discharge, which relates not to manuscripts as physical objects, as had been the case with the new finds, but to specific texts in specific languages. By looking at the erased undertexts, we can now go deeper in the multilingual history of the monastery. Now, the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine is home to perhaps the single largest collection of palimpsests that have remained in the same location, and their systematic study has only just begun. Starting in 2011, at the invitation of the synaxes of the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine and His Eminence Archbishop Damianos, Bishop of Sinai, Faran, and Rytho, the Early Manuscript Electronic Library, EMEL, with the generous grant of the Arcadia Fund, has conducted the Sinai Palimpsests project. The project was conceived and masterminded by Michael Phelps, who invited me to join as scholarly director. The aim was to use multispectral imaging, followed by computer-based processing, to create an online digital library of high-quality digital images that are searchable through an electronic catalog. When we began the project in 2011, we assumed that there would be 110 palimpsested objects. That number has now grown to 173, with 11 manuscripts featuring double palimpsests, so they were twice erased. We call them manuscript objects, as their state of preservation varies greatly, and especially among the new finds where palimpsests are very numerous, entire codices with binding are intact bindings are rare. So you get an impression here of the material that we're dealing with. But the Sinai, as I said, has an exceptionally large quantity of palimpsested material, and it may still grow further as we discover more and get better at discerning palimpsest. If you compare, for example, to the Biblioteca Laurentiana in Florence, there are 29 palimpsested objects there, or the Austrian National Library in Vienna, where there are 23 palimpsests. Within our funding period, we were able to image 74 of these, which turns out to be less than half. So, excuse me, there remains a lot of work to be done. This means that 6,800 palimpsested manuscript sides, rectos and versos, for each of which I gave an initial codicological description during more than 10 on-site visits, were imaged. Each site was captured up to 33 times with different methods of multispectral photography, and then digitally processed with different methods, amounting to a total of 85,000 images. All in all, 305 textual units were identified, and we use this terminology to denote units with the same text, the same scribe, and the same script found in the same manuscript object. And this work was done by an international team of 30 experts in the different languages that I coordinated. 96% of the texts are Christian in nature, but 4% are classical texts and therefore of particular interest. And there are several new surprises among the texts that were identified by the scholars that I will present to you at the end of my presentation. Eventually, all of this work will lead to new editions of texts by the participating scholars. For now, the results are freely accessible online thanks to a collaboration with UCLA that is accessible to everybody, and you can see on that site the images of the naked eye images and the processed images accompanied by text identifications made by the scholars. So thanks to the presence of an exceptionally large number of palimpsests in one location, we can now begin to build something resembling statistics for palimpsests and contributing to a sort of aggregate of palimpsest studies. And I'll give you a brief introduction of what that may mean. So first question is, what kind of parchment sheets were palimpsested? And as you can see here, these could often include discards that were generated in the process of the preparation of writing material. So original folios where the ruling was imperfect or the lines were not at right angles or spaced too close or too far from another. Manuscripts tended to be reused in two different ways. Either the original bifolios were left intact after disassembling the quire with the overtext then running parallel to the undertext, resulting in a codex of the same size as the original one. Or bifolios were cut in half, turned on their side and folded in order to create a new bifolio at half size. And you can see traces of that here, where you have the center fold that then appears at 90 or 270 degree angle. We can also sometimes postulate that palimpsestation had occurred when you find prickings to note the horizontal lines when they appear at the top or at the bottom margin. That's when you know that the parchment has been turned and you suspect that palimpsest exists underneath. This practice of cutting larger bifolios in half in the process of palimpsestation means that palimpsested parchment was often used for the creation of manuscripts of utilitarian character, for which a handy size was important or at least not a hindrance. Indeed, of the 74 palimpsests studied so far, 55% have liturgical texts in the upper writing. In rare cases, we encounter what might be dubbed, oh yeah, you have good evidence for the reuse of sheets that have been turned. And here you have what we call extreme palimpsestation, bifolios sewn together from a patchwork of small pieces of palimpsested parchment from different language groups. In addition to using larger codices and reducing them in size by half, there's also an increasing amount of palimpsested material that we note that has come originally from scrolls. Pasquale Orsini has been studying these, and it turns out that a large number of scrolls can be reconstructed on the basis of, or the existence at least, on the basis of the palimpsested material, attesting to the fact that even after the codex became the dominant book form, scrolls continued to be in use, except that that has not been visible to us because their survival rate as intact objects has been very low. So how were these palimpsested sheets then used? First of all, it must be noted that entire codices made up of palimpsests are relatively rare. This is counterintuitive, but it's something that we have definitely observed. Much more frequent is the case where individual quires in a codex are copied on palimpsested material. This was often done at the time when a new codex was created, but it could also happen that a quire of palimpsested folios was inserted later with overtext written in a different ink or scribal hand than the remainder of the codex. Scholars who created library catalogues in the past have often overlooked these individual quires copied on palimpsest. Indeed, on a few occasions in the course of the project, palimpsested quires in intact codices of the old collection were discovered simply by chance and happenstance, hence the increased number of palimpsests in our recent count. Second, we can be reasonably certain that the people who reused palimpsested parchment sheets were not aware of what had been written underneath. We have to imagine that at the time of reuse, palimpsested sheets of different provenance, often even in different languages, were simply piled up in random order. As a result, palimpsested folios from the same original manuscript were placed out of sequence in the creation of a new manuscript, or even dispersed across several different new codices that are now found in different libraries. Scholars have begun the painstaking work of reconstructing the original sequence of the erased undertext, and a special viewing tool on the project website facilitates the import of images from other sources to allow scholars to recreate the original sequence of the Mutterhandschrift on the basis of the undertext. Next question then is, what is the date of the undertexts? Of course, even in regular manuscripts, firm dates of copying are very rare, as we've already seen with the comparative study of scribal notes or colophons earlier on. For the erased layers, we have only 2 cases of dated material. In Sinaiticus Arabicus 5:14, the erased Syriac texts containing the letter to the Hebrews is accompanied by a colophon that carries the date of 561, 562, so it falls right within the time frame, the last years of the reign of Justinian. In Sinaiticus Arabicus New Find 8, among the many erased texts in multiple languages are 10 folios written in Arabic, perhaps originally from a scroll that contained a deed for the sale of land in Ramla with the date of 841 CE. In very few instances, the erased text reveals a colophon with the name of the copyist. One example is the Georgian scribe Gabriel, who was active in the late 10th century and whose colophon is preserved in one of two erased layers of a folio that has no overtext. To establish the time of copying of the undertext and the overtext, we thus depend entirely on paleographical criteria, such as script styles. And here too, the project has yielded important insights. For the Greek texts, a large part of the erased scripts dates from the 6th century. And this, of course, was the century dominated by the Emperor Justinian, who built the basilica and fortified the monastery. A second spike occurs in the 9th century, the period of the metacharacterismos, when the Greek script changed from majuscule capital letters to minuscule lowercase letters. So the project has been generating significant new amounts of documentation in the development of Greek majuscule writing. And you can see here the varieties of Greek script in the palimpsested layers now visible to the naked eye. Now, the next question is, what is the time span that elapsed between the application of the undertext and the application of the overtext? No clear pattern emerges for the lifetime of texts until their removal. This is something we'd really like to know, how long texts were in circulation in manuscript form, what people could read or expect to find in a library at any given moment in time. Here's just one example. In some instances, up to 4 centuries have passed, leading us to assume that the text was erased because it was no longer considered important in this form for the original owners, for the owners of the original manuscript. But in other cases, the undertext was only 1 generation old, and the overtext was of exactly the same nature, for example, hagiographical or liturgical texts. So the best we can do at the moment is to say, if we take an average, the average time span between the application of the undertext and the application of the overtext was 250 years. That's the ballpark figure. The time of erasure, however, is impossible to know, although it is usually assumed that erasure occurred shortly before the folios were reused. This is an issue familiar from dendrochronology, where freshly cut wood may be seasoned for up to 10 years before use in a panel painting, for example, or from the study of watermarks, where the molds with the distinctive designs were in use for about 2 years, and paper was used within 3 to 5 years after its production. But in all these cases, and that also includes palimpsest production, the duration of stockpiling of prepared material represents a significant and mostly unknown factor, which renders dating difficult. So what can the Sinai palimpsest tell us about language use? In many instances, it is only thanks to modern technologies of multispectral imaging that it becomes possible to recover the lost written heritage of some language communities. Already in the 1970s, and I'm referring here to a later publication, already in the 1970s, Zaza Alexidze discovered in the monastery's library fragments of a lectionary and parts of the Gospel of John written in Caucasian Albanian and probably copied as early as the 7th century. Until then, this language, which is related to the language spoken today by the Udi people in the Eastern Caucasus, had only been known from inscriptions on stone and from a manuscript glossary. The Sinai Palimpsest project has rendered many folios of Caucasian Albanian more legible, which are now being studied by Joost Gippert. Also, what has come to light is a very large number of material in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, the language of theology and of the liturgy in Palestine from the 5th to the 13th century. Thanks to the project, the corpus, the known corpus of writing in this language has been significantly increased, perhaps by as much as 30%. Some of them with previously unknown texts of a biblical or liturgical nature, and these are now being studied by Christa Müller-Kessler. Thanks to the Sinai Palimpsest project, it is now also possible to compare the distribution of languages in these 3 time slices by going to the lowest time slice in the library. In the erased layers, Greek is the dominant language. And I'll show you the pie chart because that is easier to read. Greek is the dominant language. In the old collection and the new finds, this is obvious from the survival rate of Greek manuscripts. And that in the old collection, 69%, in the new finds, 53%. That Greek material was widely available also in the erased layers emerges from the fact that erased Greek undertext appears in 32 different manuscript objects. Still, there's a certain reluctance compared to the later layers to erase Greek texts, which would still have been considered valuable. So there the Greek percentage is only 44%. Also targeted for erasure during the Middle Ages were texts in Syriac and Georgian, probably due to the availability of material in that language. We also see Christian Palestinian Aramaic, CPA, with almost 7%, and Caucasian Albanian, the language that we only know from the Sinai palimpsests. The importance of Arabic as a language of Christian theology and worship is evident here from the reluctance to erase it, so that it is only represented with just a little over 6%. What remains unknown is the origin of the erased writing material. Equally uncertain in most cases is the location where it was reused for the copying of a new manuscript. We must refrain, as I noted earlier, from automatically assuming that manuscripts now in the Sinai were also copied there. One possible clue regarding the locations where writing material was erased or where it was reused may come from the relation of overtext language to undertext languages in any given manuscript objects, and that's what I'd like to present to you next. So here you see one example of a manuscript object with multiple language layers in the erased undertext, and here are the statistics. The answer to this question may allow us to see which language groups were in closest interaction with each other, or to be more precise, who shared palimpsested parchment leaves with whom. The figures given here should be treated with caution as they may be overly generous. The count is based on the text layer groupings indicated in CatEcon, which is our recording and cataloging tool. And it does not distinguish between full manuscript sides and stubs, binding strips or foldovers from individual folios that are inserted in a manuscript, nor does it take into account triple or double or triple palimpsest layers. Still, they give some impression of the languages in the erased layer and the overtext that cluster together. As is to be expected, the overtext and the undertext languages are often the same, suggesting that language communities actually used the material they had at hand in the largest quantities. But more can be said. Some language communities seem to have been rather closed. So if you look at the undertext to overtext relation, Slavonic appears only under Slavonic, Caucasian Albanian appears only under Georgian, Ethiopic appears only under Greek, but Latin, rather surprisingly, appears under Arabic, Greek, and Slavonic. We can also inverse that relation and look at the textual and scribal communities that use palimpsested sheets. The overtext to undertext relation offers some insights into the community that applied the scriptio superior. The greatest language variety of palimpsested material is found among the Georgians. Under Georgian overtext, no less than 7 languages are represented: Arabic, Armenian, Caucasian Albanian, Christian Palestinian Aramaic, Georgian, Greek, and Syriac. Greek and Arabic scribes in Christian contexts may have been working under similar conditions as regards their access to writing material. 5 different undertext languages are found under Greek and also under Arabic. They both write on top of Greek, Arabic, CPA, and Latin. In addition, we have Arabic over Syriac and Greek over Ethiopic. This similarity in access to palimpsested material may suggest that Greek and Arabic manuscript production occurred in the same cultural and linguistic environment. The Syriac scribes used recycled sheets from 4 languages, that is Armenian, CPA, Greek, and Syriac. Only 2 different languages are represented under Slavonic, that is Slavonic and Latin, and under CPA, namely CPA and Georgian. These observations offer interesting new insights for the manifold interactions between the people from different linguistic and cultural traditions in the Christian world. There must have been hotspots for such interaction, not just at the monastery in the Sinai, but also at the monastery of Mar Saba and elsewhere in the Holy Land, which was a magnet for pilgrims from far and wide and home to numerous monasteries. Could these be the places of origin for at least some of the palimpsest manuscripts that are now in the Sinai? Even if we take into account that the majority of manuscripts, including the palimpsests, were not copied at the monastery itself, but brought there by pilgrims and other visitors, these observations offer ample evidence for the manifold interactions between people from different languages and cultures across the Christian world. Many questions about the dissemination of palimpsested sheets can only be answered by guesswork. Was there a wider market for such second-grade writing material? This seems to be suggested by the fact that erased parchment circulated across religious boundaries in the Middle Ages. The Jewish depository in the Cairo Geniza and the Muslim depository in the Kubet al-Khazna in Damascus used largely erased texts of Christian provenance. So there must have been a market for Christian manuscripts, perhaps because they were widely available. In addition, there is some evidence for the East-West movement of liturgical manuscript material, as Greek texts of southern Italian origin were later erased and overwritten in the region of Syria-Palestine. But it's not clear in what location the erasure of the undertexts occurred, whether already in Italy or later in the Holy Land. So I now come to the very last part of my presentation, namely the highlights of the discoveries, because palimpsests in a sense act like a time capsule, and there's always the possibility for discoveries. So beginning with the Greek, you have Greek, the Greek undertexts are largely liturgical, but there are a small number of secular texts, mostly of medical nature, and a very few also of from classical antiquity. In Christian Palestinian Aramaic, which was already mentioned, we have now added 19 manuscripts and significantly expanded the corpus of writing in that language, the known corpus, by about 30%. In Ethiopic, participating scholar Stephen Delamata has identified in the erased layer under a Greek horologion of the 13th century the funerary rite in Ethiopic that had previously been assumed to be of a later date. thus needing to re-evaluation of the history of the liturgy in Ethiopic because of the inversion of the chronological sequence. In Georgian, we have a new version of the Psalms. In Syriac, new discoveries include ancient and previously unknown gospel versions, as well as treatises on medicine and translations of Greek philosophy. And Grigory Kessel is working on some of these texts. A number of Syriac undertexts are now dispersed across libraries in Russia, the US, and the UK. These findings in the palimpsests, combined with the rich material in Syriac manuscripts, make St. Catherine's, along with Deir el-Suryani, the monastery of the Syrians in the Western Nile Delta, the greatest depository of old Syriac texts. In the Arabic erased texts, Alexander Traiger discovered an Arabic version of Genesis and Exodus copied in the 10th or 11th century. This is quite unique. It is probably a translation from Hebrew into Arabic made for an Arabic-speaking Jewish community in North Africa. In the Greek undertexts of Sinaiticus Arabicus New Finds 66, Giulia Rossetto has been able to identify and will soon publish a previously unknown text from classical antiquity. The upper layer, copied in the year 903 at Marsaba, contains hagiographical works. The 2 folios of erased Greek, which you see in the red script here, were copied in the 5th or 6th century. Enough of the text survives to suggest that it contains a previously unknown mythological text in hexameters that recounts the youth of the god Dionysus, which originates from an epic originally in 23 books, perhaps the Orphic poem known as Hieroi Logoi. And we are particularly pleased that this discovery was made by a doctoral student who worked as an assistant on the project. Further new discoveries in Greek include a canon on St. Nicholas, an anthology of psalms, and a version of the Ladder of John Climacus, a treasured work of monastic spirituality then as now. There's also a surprising amount of Latin, which was increased in the course of the project when we discovered previously unrecognized quires, a total of 48 folios with Latin undertext. Sometimes erased pictorial material has come to light in the course of the Sinai Palimpsest project, so we're not only looking at text, sometimes we are also finding images. In the erased undertext of Arabic New Finds 8, there's a text on medicinal plants, perhaps by Crateuias, as Nigel Wilson suggests, copied into a 5th to 6th century majuscule, with drawings reminiscent of, but not identical to, the Vienna Dioscorides of the 6th century. And it was the merit of the chief camera operator, Damianos Kazotakis, to have first seen that these 2 folios actually belong together because they are at different places in the manuscript. In the double palimpsest Slavic New Finds 5, whose overtext was applied in the 2nd quarter of the 11th century, Heinz Miklas has detected in the lowest erased layer, written in Glagolica, a few faint traces of a figural drawing of a religious nature. It's difficult to show you this, but there will be a publication of this soon. The most spectacular find is perhaps Arabic New Finds 8, a few additional folios. This is really the manuscript that has the extreme palimpsestation. As you remember, the earlier patchwork manuscript I showed you, folio that I showed you, came from that origin as well. But the greatest surprise here is the undertext in Latin. The greatest surprise came from these folios here, because the Arabic overtext was written quite early, 750 to 800, and below it are parts of the Latin translation of the ancient Greek novel about Apollonius of Tyros or Tyre, probably copied in the 6th century. Previously, the Latin version of this text was only known from a single 10th century manuscript, now in Budapest. The identification of this text by David Ganz was also supported by Michelle Brown and Daniela Meyerhofer. What is more, there is a line drawing which makes this, and you can see that here, which makes this the oldest secular manuscript illumination in Latin. So this is a rarity in several ways. It is a Latin work which tells a story set in pagan antiquity that continued to be an inspiration to virtue for Christians. Copied in an early majuscule, the Sinai erased layer represents the earliest known non-Christian pictorial representation in a parchment manuscript. So to conclude, while the material that has been gathered so far through the Sinai Palimpsest project is sure to generate much further study, and this is, we've only looked at less than half of the palimpsest holdings, I have to emphasize, we can conclude that the presence of up to 13 languages of the Christian world in the library's collection is testimony to the hospitality of the monks as they facilitated liturgical services in a variety of languages. It was precisely the mystique of the remoteness of the desert and mountain that exercised a magnetic attraction on the countless pious visitors who came from all the corners of the earth and whose presence is still tangible to us today in the many different languages that can be traced at different stages through the long history of the monastery's library. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your question and show you also the bibliography with a few selected, very selected items, but also the websites.
Thank you, Professor Rapp. I would like to open an official section for questions and answers. So I guess I will be just reading. Everybody can see questions written in Q&A. You can just click on it, but I will announce questions. So the first is a piece of information. A new Sinai archive website is forthcoming, a collaborative effort between the University of Michigan and Princeton University, a digital effort of the Michigan-Princeton Alexandria expeditions, the Sinai in the 1950s and 60s. Then Lisa Fagan Davis is asking, I'd love to hear more about why there are so many Georgian manuscripts at St. Catherine's, and I would also love to hear that.
The Georgians had a very strong presence in the Holy Land with individual monasteries just where there were just Georgians, but also joining other monasteries, for example, Marsaba. And the Holy Land was in fact where a lot of Christian Georgian literature was produced. And a lot of translation activity from Greek into Georgian, especially of hagiographical texts, occurred. And they seem to have been particularly active in the 10th century. This was the 10th, 11th century was the great flourishing of Georgian culture, both in the Caucasus and in the larger world. I don't want to call it diaspora communities because that would not convey the right sense. And there was one scribe in particular, Jovanit Zosime, who single-handedly worked as a copyist, as a bookbinder, and is responsible, I think, for several dozens of manuscripts that are now in the Sinai. I can't hear you, Julia. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Can you please elaborate on what you said about missing evidence for a Greek scriptorium? What would count as evidence apart from scribes disclosing that a manuscript was written at St. Catherine's? In other words, what would one have to look for and what is missing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, I'm very conservative. I'm saying, we have no positive evidence for a scriptorium because we only have these very few instances of scribes that note that they were active in the Sinai. In addition to scribal notes, you might look for external evidence in the sense of other people who visit the monastery reporting on seeing scribes at work, for example. But none of that exists. But if we had it, that would be great.
Could you tell us a bit more about the origin of the Latin pieces?
Here I have to refer you to the work of Michelle Brown, whose work is also, at least one of her works is referred to in the further readings at the end, because she is responsible for cataloging all the Latin at the monastery, both the extant Latin in the old collection and the new finds, and she's also been working along with other scholars on the Latin erased texts in the Sinai Palimpsest project. So there's a lot of forthcoming work, but if you follow up on Michelle Brown's bibliography, you will find the first glimpses of what to look for in the future as well.
So the next question is, given that average of 250 years, do you know the median value for when palimpsests are made? Sorry, my screen is moving. I'd like to get closer to understanding the moment at which a manuscript is deemed no longer usable. Also, given the point that palimpsested folios are distributed randomly, can we make anything of the relationship between new text and old text? Isn't this random, or is that only in some cases? Finally, sorry for all the questions, it's all too exciting. Is it possible to estimate the size of the community? In other words, for example, in the 6th century, if copyists aren't likely to know where their palimpsest sheets come from, does that imply an industrial scale to the copying process?
Wow, lots of questions, and I agree entirely. It's all too exciting. And there's still, the more we know, the more we realize what we don't know. But that's how scholarship works. We haven't done the median count. No, that could be interesting, but the variation is so great. And as I said, we must assume that people who used palimpsested sheets did not know what was underneath originally. And something we also don't know is how widely palimpsested sheets were traded. I tried to get at that at the end of my paper when I suggested that there was a lot of Christian palimpsested material that was used and then found in the Cairo Geniza and in the Muslim depository in Damascus. So that seems to suggest that there was a trade going on, and it's not just people taking things off their shelves and reusing them. But that's as much as I can tell you at the moment.
Thank you very much for the talk. Could you briefly outline the different technologies that the team has used in producing the multispectral images?
Yes, that's a detailed and technical question. It's easiest if you look at the website for the Sinai Palimpsest project at UCLA, because that's where it's all explained in great detail. All I can say is that EMIL works to the highest standards and has taken more exposures of individual rectos and versos than has been done in other projects with different bandwidths of light and different kinds of illumination. And then this assembly of 33 images is then subjected to different methods of image processing. First batch processing, and then individualized processing, often in conjunction and in conversation with the scholars who are deciphering text and who may say, give me more contrast in this area of the folio, or show me how this particular stroke can be enhanced in order to see what kind of letter shape it may have been.
The next question is, where can I find more info about the Dionysus mythological poem or the student working on it? Many thanks. This is fascinating in every respect.
Yes, and there's already the website. The doctoral student is now Dr. Rossetto, and the article is in process of publication, and there's also a website that has been put up by a colleague where you can find out more.
Next, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I find the absence of Coptic among the erased texts surprising, especially given the proximity of Egypt. Is there any reason for why this could be the case?
Well, as I said earlier, the monastery was in ecclesiastical union, and the monks remain in ecclesiastical union with the Church of Constantinople. The Coptic Church, however, is not. And that's the result of the Council of Chalcedon, when the local Egyptian church went its own way. And so it is not surprising that there is no Coptic in the erased texts, and also not in the extant collection.
There is another question about Dionysus' poem. Has it been published?
Well, that's been answered in the chat, I think.
Okay.
Julia Rossetto has just given the link in the chat herself. Okay, well, that's interesting. Everybody is talking. This is great.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep my attention at questions, so I'm not looking at all the chat. So there's another link. Joseph, here's a bit of technology. There's a link to Sinai Palimpsest website. I'm really looking forward to the publication of the fragment from the Hierologium.
Yes,
okay.
that's the pagan text.
What a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for sharing the project. Loving the talk. Thank you for giving it and organizing it respectively. Do you happen to know if the monks at the monastery kept a journal or chronology? I came across mention of a legendary hidden monastery close to St. Catherine in an Arabic text of the early modern period. The mention refers to the Book of the Monks for details.
Very interesting. First of all, Jim Stokes, greetings. Thank you for being there. And also Mike Phelps, who is, of course, the mastermind of the entire Sinai Palimpsest project. The Book of the Monks, I have no idea. It would be interesting to know more about this, if you would be willing to share that. The only thing that comes to mind would be a book that they might keep to record the death of the community. But again, I don't know. And if anybody knows, it would be interesting if you could share that with us.
Another question, I would also like to ask whether doctrinal, especially Miaphysitic issues, impacted the circulation of manuscripts, for example, Coptic, Ethiopic. Many thanks again.
Well, I think the Coptic was addressed. Ethiopic, we only have this one particular instance. So again, not much known. Of course, it would be wonderful to be able to compare what we see in the Sinai also in terms of what we can reconstruct, how the library collection looked at various moments in time, and how the languages interact. Again, always with the proviso that we don't know how long these manuscripts have been in the Sinai. It would be interesting to compare that, for example, with the monastery of Mar Saba in the Holy Land, which was another multilingual hotspot. And for that, there is a volume in the making as a result of a conference that happened 2 years ago, that will soon be published by Breppholz, edited by Daniel Galatza and others who also made his name known in the chat earlier on.
So there are multiple thanks for fascinating presentation that I'm skipping. Could you tell us a little more about the Caucasian Albanian text?
Yes. It's a New Testament text from the epistles. And as I said, it was discovered by Zaza Alexidze, who was looking at the Georgian manuscripts in the Sinai. And of course, as a Georgian scholar, he knew that Caucasian Albanian existed, but he'd never seen it. Nobody had ever seen it in manuscript form. One had only seen the letters and the alphabet in other media. But I think he worked with the help of an ultraviolet light and only later used multispectral imaging. And now with the Sinai Palimpsest project, we have greatly enhanced the image quality and therefore the legibility of the text that Jos Gippert is working on in continuation of Zaza Alexidze. I've heard Zaza Alexidze give a talk about his discovery at UCLA many years ago when he said he first worked like you would when you try to decipher text as a spy. He saw on the page the same sequence of letters 3 times. And then all he had to do was, he suspected it would be Christian text, and he suspected it might be a New Testament text. So all he needed to do was to skim the New Testament and find a passage where in close proximity the same word appears 3 times. And based on that, he was then able to crack the secret, with the help of the Greek passage that he had then identified, to piece everything together and to reconstruct this language.
Wonderful presentation. I would like to know a little bit more about the Slavonic collection that have been found in Sinai. Thank you for asking this question. If you're familiar, what is the prevailing context of these manuscripts?
There I have to refer you to Heinz Miklas, who's been a participating scholar in the project and who has already many years before the Sinai Palimpsest project began, been to the Sinai to work on glagolitic liturgical texts that are now also published. It is very striking that much of the earliest liturgical manuscripts in Slavonic actually is preserved in the Sinai. What exactly that means for the Slavicists, I'll leave for others to say. Julia, do you want to speculate?
Not in front of 200 people.
Okay.
There's another question about Slavonic manuscript. Second, my chat is moving all the time. Thank you for your wonderful and fascinating presentation. I would like to ask about Codex Sinaiticus 39, Slavonic manuscript, Albauer and Marish, published in 1981, palimpsested page, glagolitic script from the Gospel. Is in any manuscript any other palimpsested page? Is there any other palimpsested page in this manuscript?
I do not have an answer offhand to that. I'm sorry. Again, if you look at the website at UCLA, you will be able to see the manuscripts that have been imaged. And that will also give you an idea of what still has not been imaged.
Grateful for this talk. Thank you especially for highlighting how these languages and cultures were nurtured in the collection of scripts. Do the dates of erasures of undertexts correlate to any political or liturgical ruptures? In other words, is there evidence that there could have been a purgative, doctrinal, political, cultural motive for their erasures?
Yeah, it's a question that often gets asked, but as I tried to make clear, all we know is, or that we can guess at on the basis of paleographical criteria, if we don't have the colophons, is the date of script application in the undertext and the overtext. We do not know the date of erasure, and we do not know the length of stockpiling of erased material. And that's the big unknown.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Has the fascinating material on the Latin Apollonius of Tyre been published?
Yes, as I said, look for Michelle Brown's article that is in the further reading at the end of the video, which will be made available, as has been said earlier, within a week's time.
Do you think one could expect more fragments of Codex Sinaiticus coming forth from palimpsests?
Probably not from palimpsests, but in the new finds, there were 2 folios of Codex Sinaiticus that were found in that depository, which are still at the monastery. As is well known, the large bulk of Codex Sinaiticus is now in the British Library, where it has traveled through a very long detour, thanks to Konstantin Tischendorf.
So this is the answer from Michelle Brown. Someone asked earlier about what other Latin texts were found. In the palimpsest, there are also fragments of an early biblical text, possibly from Italy, and 2 insular late 8th century hymns, possibly from a pocket gospel book. I've published this in an earlier article. You can find the reference if the, I'm sorry, what is FNs of the Apollonius article? Footnotes. Oh, okay. If the footnotes of the Apollonian article that is in Claudia's bibliography. Thanks for presenting this all so clearly, Claudia. Very interesting talk. No mention for the conservation works that took place in the monastery.
Well, that would be the topic of yet another talk. If I'd had more time, I would have emphasized, in conjunction with the fact that evidence for a monastic scriptorium in Greek at the monastery is scarce, I would have mentioned the fact that there is, in fact, evidence for the 16th and 17th century of bookbinding activity on a large scale at the monastery. And that has all been studied very systematically, thanks to Nicholas Pickwoad and his students, with funding support of the St. Catherine Foundation. But it would be too much to go into detail about this.
Thank you very much for the talk. Can you explain why there's so relatively small amount of Armenian manuscripts?
Again, that has to do with doctrinal differences, the same pattern of explanation as why there's so few Coptic material. After the 5th and 6th century, the Church of Constantinople and the Church in Armenia went separate ways.
Another question about glagolitic palimpsests. Thank you so much for your presentation. Have geographical points of origin for the glagolitic palimpsests been determined? Is there enough text to identify specific linguistic features that would aid in the process of regional identification? I would like to know the answer to this question.
Wow. Well, something that I think needs to be made very clear is what we often have is individual folios. If you have the recto and the verso of a bifolio in the same language, and maybe that has been eaten by mice, and maybe the overtext obscures a lot of it, it's often the case that you do not really have consecutive text. it's very, very painstaking work to even identify on the basis of a few lines here and a few words there what the erased undertext is. So really, we should give credit to all the scholars who've been working to identify the texts to the best of their ability. But very often it's not possible to have consecutive text. So for the Glagolitic, again, look for the publications for Heinz Miklas, and maybe look for the images online and see whether you want to try your own hand at this.
I feel very tempted. Why the Copts are excluded and not the Georgians?
There were a lot of Georgians who were in ecclesiastical unity with Constantinople. That's all I can say. I wouldn't call it a process of exclusion. It's just, it's not a deliberate setting up of boundaries for somebody who wants to get in. It's really different religious cultures going separate ways.
So we are really coming to the close. I don't know, Claudia, how many questions would you like to take?
Well, there is one more, I think, by Daniel.
There's maybe 5 more.
Okay, yeah, we can do this.
Yeah, okay. Has the information from palimpsests and new colophons revealed any new information on the biography of the scribe Jovan Zosima, whom you mentioned, or the Georgian migration from Marsaba to Sinai?
I don't think so, Daniel. It would be good if it had, but I don't think that's the case, no.
Thank you very much for presenting this talk.
I should mention that the Georgian colleagues are preparing a major publication on the history of Georgian manuscripts in the Sinai and the history of the scribes. I've seen an early version of this, and it should be coming out in the next 1 or 2 years, and it should be absolutely magnificent and wonderfully detailed.
Thank you very much for presenting this talk. It is interesting that Christian manuscripts could be reused for Jewish and Muslim documents, but we don't see much evidence for reuse across the Chalcedonian divide, as was brought up by the questions on Coptic and Armenian manuscripts.
Very true, very true. Timothy Shanks, I should add as a footnote to what you're saying, what I've presented here is going to be published in a volume, New Light on Old Manuscripts. That's also the bibliography, where many of the participating scholars of the Sinai Palimpsest projects and the imaging team and the technical support team and the computer reading, developing team of the images, so the camera team and the computing team, have all presentations as well as other comparative projects. So this volume is in preparation. It'll be edited by Grigory Kessel, Gianna Gruskova, Julia Rossetto, and myself. It'll hopefully be out within a year or 2. And that's where you can find also an important article by Ronnie Volant on comparing the Cairo Geniza with the Kibbutz el-Kuzma in Damascus.
So the last question we really have to end because Lynn has to go off and then the presentation will close automatically. So thank you so much for a fascinating speech. What do we know about the writer of the scripts?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that. It's as often as the case, we see the traces of human activity and we can only guess at the people behind it.
Well, there's also a question about recommendation for historical fiction book that covers St. Catherine Monastery. I don't know.
I can't think of anything, but what is a good read is the book by Janet Soskis, The Sisters of Sinai, which talks about two learned ladies from Cambridge who join the biblical manuscript hunters at the beginning of the 20th century and make several trips to the Sinai after teaching themselves Arabic, among other things.
Thank you. So Lynn, do you want to
I just
officially
want to
close?
sure, I don't have anything formal to say except to thank you very much, Claudia, for an excellent presentation and for all the questions and everyone's attention during this. It was a fantastic presentation, and I we're doing more.
Yes, and I also want to echo all the thanks and all the praise, and I really hope that we'll have you back in person at Penn at the nearest future.
I'd be very happy to, and thank you to everybody who's been listening and thinking along and asking questions, and go visit the website and see what emerges. This is all work in progress. Thank you to everybody at Penn, also to the tech team in the background for making this all possible. And thank you, Julia, for the invitation.
You're welcome, my pleasure.
All right, so until next time, everyone take care and be safe and stay healthy. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.